Glad so many of you have showed back up. It clearly means you're interested. A few more people have even turned up. So welcome back. So this morning we looked at the more contemporary situation in Afghanistan with regard to the U.S. and Russia. Some very fascinating presentations. Today or this afternoon we're going to step back in time a little bit and look more at the historical example. And we've got a couple of great speakers. I'll say at the outset, we were going to have Professor Arne Westad from Harvard. He had very generously agreed basically to fly all the way back from China and en route back to Harvard, stop here. Unfortunately, he's been detained, but held up, shall we say. I have to be careful with my word
Even
choice.
held up is a problem.
Held up, yes. He has not made it back from China. Let me put it that way. I believe he's fine. He was very apologetic. We'll hopefully get him down for another event in the spring, because he is really one of the preeminent historians of the U.S., Russia, Afghanistan relationship, particularly the 1980s period. But so today, in lieu of him, I've been reading his work for 20 years. I'll sort of be the understudy for this and talk a little bit, certainly about what I've learned from his work. But we also have two extraordinarily distinguished speakers. Ben Fischer, who retired after a very long career at the Central Intelligence Agency and then became the agency's chief historian. He's written a number of remarkable pieces of intelligence history, including one on the Able Archer crisis of 1983. He's also written a number of things looking at the use of double agents in the Cold War, and particularly a criticism of a recent book called The $1 Billion Spy. So he's a fantastic historian. He's going to talk about covert action more generally and the link between Poland and the Afghanistan campaign, the two big campaigns of the Cold War. David Edwards, an anthropologist by training, one of the really preeminent anthropologists looking at Afghan society from the late 19th and especially the 20th centuries and now into the 21st. His book, Before Taliban, remains, I think, probably the single best one-volume work to understand how Afghanistan has arrived at the position that it's in. He's more recently done work on the evolution of suicide bombing, so I think he's going to talk to some of these issues. And of course, we have Dipali Mukhopadhyay, who's generously agreed to moderate, and so with that, I'll hand it over to Dipali.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us. We're going to have comments about 15 to 20 minutes from each of our speakers, and then we'll open it up to conversation. So, David, do you want to start?
Well, first I want to echo the comments of people this morning, thanking Austin for putting this together. I find in my time that sometimes when conference opportunities to speak at conferences come along, one of the nice things about them is that they encourage you to think a little bit differently or from a slightly skewed angle from the way you get routinized into thinking. And this is true in this particular occasion as well. We often think about the 1989 as the critical date because that was the date that the Soviets actually withdrew. But 1986 was also a really interesting time, and I started, because of the speaking today, I started thinking about what happened during that period when the decision to withdraw was first announced, when Gorbachev first decided that was going to be the route that the Soviets were going to take. So I want to frame my comments today around three battles that took place in and around that period of from 1985-86 through 1989. And they're battles that were important less because of their tactical significance and more because they laid the groundwork. They really created the landscape of Afghanistan for later on. And I want to make the case that even understanding the evolution of al-Qaeda and even understanding the evolution of the Islamic State requires understanding what happened in Afghanistan during this crucial period of time. The first battle, or it was actually a two-stage battle, part of the end game that the Soviets were engaged in from 1985 on, happened at the Mujahideen base at Jawhar in Paktia province, right over the border in Afghanistan, only 5 miles from the border with Pakistan, 15 miles from Miram Shah. Which was and Jawhar was an important staging, both a staging area and a transit base for Mujahideen, particularly belonging to the two wings of Hezb Islami, of Hekmatyar and of Khales, two of the more important parties that were engaged in the war against the Soviets. And for reasons that are still a little bit mysterious, the Soviets decided at the end that they had to take out these bases. So in the fall of 1985 and then again in the spring of 1986, they engaged in two strategic operations against Jawhar, trying to eliminate this base. We know from the events of in December 2001 about the Tora Bora base, further to the north, closer to Parachinar and north of Khost, about the cave complex that bin Laden created at Tora Bora. Well, the first cave complex was created at Jawhar. It had deep tunnels within this riverbed gorge, a dried up riverbed gorge, that was the first kind of engineering marvel of the Mujahideen. A place that I had the opportunity to visit in 1984, a year and a half before this battle took place. It was a central hub for one of the important Mujahideen commanders who remains an important figure today. Particularly, he's elderly now, but his sons are now running the Haqqani network, Jalaluddin Haqqani, who was in charge of the base. And so the first stage of this battle, the Afghan government troops mounted an assault on. I'm not going to go into the details. I'm not a military historian in any case, but the Afghan government, with air support from the Soviets, engaged in an assault on the base. They got close to it, but did not manage to overtake it. The following spring, and this was after Gorbachev had announced the intention to withdraw. They initiated a second siege of the base. In this one, the Soviet airborne troops were more directly involved, particularly after the first stage of the second phase of the attack against Jawhar failed. The Soviets took the prime position, but that too, and they managed to take control of the base briefly, but then only held on to it for a short period of time before the Mujahideen retook control of the base. So, an inconclusive battle ended up more or less as a stalemate. Didn't have any particular strategic importance, but I think it had importance in terms of establishing the landscape of Afghanistan subsequently. One thing certainly was that it amplified, it boosted the reputation of Jalaluddin Haqqani, who became he was always one of the more effective military commanders among the Mujahideen, and I think that his stock rose as a result. The DRA, the Afghan government, the communist government, portrayed the battle against Jawhar as a great victory. They handed out medals, but the Mujahideen did the same thing. They also saw it as, because of the fact that they ultimately were able to dislodge the Soviets, they saw it as a win for them. And this was certainly something that allowed Haqqani's reputation to expand. But the aspect of the battle that I want to focus on that I think was most important, was actually the role of the Arab Mujahideen. A number of Arab Afghans people who became subsequently known as Afghan Arabs or Arab Afghans, had been brought to Afghanistan initially, and largely through the role of a Jordanian by the name of Abdullah Azzam. And Azzam was an important figure, the founder of al-Qaeda, along with Osama bin Laden. And Azzam's reputation grew based upon a number of works that he wrote and that were published in Arabic initially, but then translated in a number of different languages. And they promoted the idea of martyrdom. And specifically, one of the books was basically a hagiography of Arabs who died in Afghanistan. And the second book was a compendium of miracle stories associated with the Arabs who died fighting in Afghanistan. And these books, as I said, were translated and spread out through the Arab world and beyond, and led to many people, many of these Arab Afghans, in the hundreds and later in the thousands, who arrived to participate in the jihad. And one of the characteristics of these early Arab mujahideen in Afghanistan is that they really wanted to die. Their goal really was martyrdom, and they eschewed training. They eschewed arms training, strategic. The idea of actually winning the war against the Soviet Union was less important for a lot of them than the possibility of dying. And I make these comments largely based upon the testimony of a Arab who was one of the top leaders of the Arab Afghan movement in Afghanistan, named Mustafa Hamid, who wrote a book called The Arabs at War in Afghanistan. So part of this is testimony from Hamid. And one of the things that Hamid says in his book is that the Arabs who fought at Jawar were so incompetent that they were known among the Afghans as the brigade of the humorous. They were basically incompetent and helpless and had no utility in terms of defending the base. Their eagerness was for martyrdom, as I indicated, and they were entirely they viewed training in arms and in strategy as a secular innovation that really was irrelevant to their own purposes. At this same time, this is when Osama bin Laden comes into the picture, because bin Laden and Azam had an uneasy relationship for some time, and bin Laden was more strategically oriented than Azam. Azam was impractical and militarily untrained, unversed. Bin Laden decided that training was important, and this brings me to the second battle that I want to discuss, which is the Battle of Jaji, which happened in a year later. After the battles of Jawar, bin Laden began the construction of a new base that was known as Masada, the Lion's Den, which was, as the crow flies, fairly close to Jawar, but it was on the other side of Khost, which was the capital of Paktia province. And he also, with his engineering training, he brought in lots of construction equipment, built another set of caves and tunnels into the side of the mountain. And in April of 1987, the Afghans, with Soviet air support again, attacked Masada. And they also used the Spetsnaz, I may be pronouncing this wrong, airborne troops. The 200 were dispatched to attack the base. A variety of different mujahideen groups came to the defense of bin Laden and the base. Bin Laden himself it was his only combat experience, the only time that he was actually engaged in combat. But the fact that they ultimately were again able, the mujahideen were again able to dispatch the Soviets, created a victory that, as happened in the case of Haqqani, augmented the reputation of Osama bin Laden. And it augmented his reputation not only in the eyes of others, but most especially in his own eyes. And from that point on, he really thought of himself as a heroic figure, as someone who, as Hamid says, he thought he was, this is quoting Hamid from his book, he thought he was a hero and he could come like a musketeer on his horse and win the battle by himself. Later, this behavior became even bigger when he declared war on America, thinking he could liberate the Ummah by himself. So bin Laden's reputation, both in the eyes of others and his own eyes, increased at that point. At the same time, he also, though, and I think this is connected to what I just said, his focus shifted away from Afghanistan. his focus had, he always viewed Afghanistan as a base for a larger operation particularly against Saudi Arabia and the royal family in Saudi Arabia. But I think more than ever, he began to be interested in the idea of founding an Islamic State elsewhere and using Afghanistan as a training base. Now, the third decisive battle, again, decisive not in a military sense, but rather in terms of how it established the ground for the landscape of post-war Afghanistan, including up to today, was the Battle of Jalalabad in the spring of 1989. This was shortly after the Soviets withdrew. And the Mujahideen at that point were confident that without Soviet support, the regime in Kabul, the Najibullah regime in Kabul, would quickly disintegrate and collapse. And they were bolstered in that belief, I think, by both Pakistanis and Americans who had their own agenda. The Americans, I think, wanted to humiliate the Soviets, to have their departure from Afghanistan accompanied by a humiliation similar to the one that we suffered in Vietnam. Be that as may, there was a clear desire to establish a provisional capital in Jalalabad. It was believed that Jalalabad would quickly collapse. This was the origins of a major operation involving some 10,000 mujahideen from a variety of different parties, and also including a number of the Arab Afghans. This was the kind of operation that the Mujahideen had never been engaged in before. They had been largely successful through ambush, through hit-and-run kinds of operations, and not through full-scale sieges on a city. This was the first time they had ever tried that, and it didn't work well. They didn't have coordinated leadership. They didn't have any real idea of how to engage in a battle of this sort. And while the Soviets had left, they had also left behind Scud air defense systems. They had left behind, they were still operating in the air, and the Afghan Mujahideen were not sufficiently skilled, so they massed their troops and became easy targets even for the imprecise artillery that the Scud batteries unleashed on them. So ultimately, the Mujahideen suffered terrible casualties. Something like 3,000 casualties out of the 10,000 that had massed in the first place. 12 to 15,000 civilians were dead, and 10,000 or more were displaced. And it was a disaster that led ultimately to the continuation of the war, and ultimately of the civil war that broke out in Afghanistan when the communist government ultimately did fall in 1992. Again, quoting Mustafa Hamid, the Arab who was involved in this period, who was in Afghanistan during this period, he says that Jalalabad is even more important than 9/11. In his view, that the end of al-Qaeda really was at the Battle of Jalalabad. And so he sees that, in his own view, that if you really want to understand the landscape of jihad now, you have to go back to the Battle of Jalalabad. And he says this because for one thing, both bin Laden and Azam, who died of who was assassinated shortly after this, but both bin Laden and Azam lost support. They lost prestige in the eyes of the Arabs, and at the same time, a lot of the people who had been brought to Afghanistan by Azam in the first place were people who had very little training in Islam. They had no background in Islam. They were attracted by this romantic idea of martyrdom. And a lot of these people had no respect for traditional Islamic authority. They became known as takfiris, those who would declare, based upon they had no legitimate authority to do so, but they would declare both rulers or authority figures as kafir, as infidels. And this movement, what's known as Takfiri, created a kind of a chaos, an anarchy within the ranks of the Mujahideen, the Arab Mujahideen in particular. And after the failure of the Battle of Jalalabad, where the traditional Mujahideen leaders and the clerical leaders were all, in some ways, lost a lot of their prestige, the Takfiris came to the fore. Hamid refers to them as this is the school of Jalalabad, the Takfiri school of Jalalabad that emerged at this point. And when the Battle of Jalalabad failed to actually create a provisional capital in Jalalabad, there was really uncertainty what to do next. And a lot of these Takfiri from different Arab countries gradually returned to their home countries. Most famously, the Takfiris returned to Algeria and other North African countries, but they were responsible for the Islamic movement that emerged in North Africa and the central Middle East. One of the most famous of the people who were part of this Takfiri movement was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who went on eventually to found the organization. Initially, he was with Al-Qaeda, but then later founded the organization that became the Islamic State. So I think that one thing we can see in this period is that the emphasis tends to be solely within Afghanistan, but I think these three battles collectively demonstrate the way in which Afghanistan, in ways that we often overlook, came to affect the history of the Middle East more generally. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Okay, next we have Benjamin Fischer.
Hello. A couple of weeks ago when Austin wrote me and asked me if I would be willing to participate in this program, I said there's just one big problem. I don't know anything about Afghanistan, but I'd really like to come to New York anyway. So my counteroffer was to talk about Afghanistan in connection with something else that I know more about, which was our covert action support for solidarity movement in Poland. I think the two are related. Now I'll try to explain what I mean by that. In the last decade of the Cold War, we had two covert actions on either periphery of the Soviet Empire, one on the western periphery, one on the eastern periphery. The one on the eastern periphery in Afghanistan is what we called among ourselves a lethal covert action. Lethal covert action blows things up, burns things down, and it kills people. The concept is rather simple. The execution is more complicated. The non-lethal operation was in Poland. We call that a political psychological operation. The purpose there is to change political thinking, behavior, win hearts and minds, and with the way people behave, the way people think. Now, what is the connection between the two? The Poles watched the events in Afghanistan very carefully because they understood that it had implications for them. If the Soviets did well in Afghanistan, it probably meant that the Poles would live under communism for another generation. But if the Russians embarrassed themselves, humiliated themselves, got weaker, if, as it turned out, they humiliated and had to withdraw, it signaled to the Poles that the Soviet system was a lot weaker than people thought it would be. It spelled the end of the Brezhnev doctrine of limited sovereignty, and it meant that in all probability the Kremlin was not going to use force to hold its empire together. Now, all of this comes down for the year and a half that Solidarity was a legal trade union. You know, it began as a trade union, but it morphed into a national protest movement of 10 million people. That's 1/3 of the population of Poland and the majority of the adult population. Even people in the secret police joined Solidarity. The Russians began monitoring it very carefully, and they set up a commission within the Politburo. It was known as the Suslov Commission because Suslov is the ideological expert in the Politburo. The other members were Yuri Andropov, head of KGB, Ustinov, the defense minister, and of course Gromyko, the foreign minister. These are the same people who a year earlier had advised Brezhnev to send troops into Afghanistan. Okay, very same people. Then they watched events carefully in Poland. They saw what was going on there, and they then began leaning on this General Jaruzelski, who was then the defense minister, to try to set his own house in order and to restore law and order and suppress solidarity. But by this point, they knew that they couldn't do it themselves. The decisive event is a Politburo meeting on December 10, 1981. Martial law was declared 2 days later in Poland. And they're very worried about what Jaruzelski is going to do, because he's got cold feet. He's tried to dance around and avoid making a firm decision. So this commission is addressing the Politburo. If you read the transcript carefully, you'll see that the decisions were not made within the Politburo. They were made outside by consensus and brought to the Politburo to be rubber stamped. And the first to speak was Andropov, and he said, we do not intend to introduce troops into Poland. That is the correct position, and we must observe it to the end. I do not know how matters will develop in Poland, and this is the kicker, but even if Poland comes under the authority of solidarity, so be it. Suslov then rounds out the discussion, and he says, if troops are introduced, that would be a catastrophe. I think that we share a unanimous opinion, meaning their opinion, which the Politburo is to accept, a unanimous opinion that there can be no discussion of any introduction of troops. Now, they brought in experts. Babakov, who was the head of Gosplan, he came in and he said, we can't send the Poles money because we don't have any. We could send them food, but we got to take it out of the Russian people's mouth. They stockpiled food. And this was after the announcement of this new food program. Well, we can feed the Poles, but then we can't feed our own people. So that's a non-starter. Afghanistan is never mentioned, but it's the elephant in the room, because they do talk about the effect of the sanctions that were imposed on them and which surprised them and which lasted longer than they thought. And they also talk about world public opinion. They cannot risk another major military action, and they probably didn't have enough troops anyway. You know, they capped the troop level at 110,000, but they had to worry about NATO and they had to worry about China as well. So I think in some ways the Poles owed a great deal of gratitude to the Afghans who were fighting on the other front. And as I said, this group of old men, they're the very same ones who made this decision a year earlier. So here they are in this bizarre situation. They're willing to give up their key ally who had the biggest and best army, which Poland was the linchpin in their logistical and communications system between the Kremlin and East Germany, where they had 450,000 troops in the Soviet Group of Forces of Germany, which is their main shock force that they would have used in the case of a war. It sort of almost boggles the mind. And they're doing this to show up some very dubious Marxist regime that people talked about this morning in Kabul for reasons that I'm not quite sure, except I guess at this point it was a matter of pride or a matter of revolutionary zeal is not quite clear, but they seem to have their priorities wrong. Now the Afghan thing, what did the Poles do for the Afghans? There's a marvelous BBC program years ago called The Spying Game, and one of the episodes was on covert action, and this is really where I got the idea of twinning the two. And they pointed out that Poland was a source of arms and ammunition for the war in Afghanistan in the period before we provided Stinger missiles, when we were still maintaining plausible deniability. We used only Soviet and Soviet-made or Soviet-style weapons. We got AK-47s from China, from India, not India, Egypt, and that was, as I said, that was to maintain the. I mean, everybody knew we were involved, but it maintained the fiction that we weren't involved. So I was thinking about this, and I included in a lecture that I gave at the agency in the history course there. And CIA people, they don't like to speak up in a classroom situation because you don't know who's cleared for what. and it can be embarrassing if you say the wrong thing. I remember somebody mentioned drones, and they got in big trouble. Anyway, but they'll come up to you after class, and they'll tell you the damnedest things. So this young man came up to me afterwards. He says, I know a whole lot about the connection between Poland and Afghanistan. And I said, well, what's your story? And he said, well, we're running low on AK-47 ammunition. So they told me to go out and find some way to buy some. So I said, I knew this European arms dealer, and I knew he had contacts in Poland. So I gave him a bunch of money, sent him to Warsaw. So he goes to Warsaw, looks up the guy he knows, and he tells, I got a shopping list here, and I need your help. And the guy said, Pole says, this is difficult. This is government property. There's red tape. You need export license. And they're going back and forth. All the reasons why he can do it. Suddenly he says to the guy, what do you want all these bullets for? And he says, well, I can't tell you who I'm working for, but there's some people that want to send them to Afghanistan and kill Russians. Pole said, how many rounds do you need? That, at least it's a true story as far as I know. Okay, and it doesn't surprise me. But Poland was a source of arms and ammunition for this operation when it was still allegedly covert. I talk a little bit about. I was in Germany. The Afghan dilemma, it resonated in Germany. And I don't think most people know this because your image of Germany in this period are these massive peace and anti-nuclear demonstrations. But behind the scenes, a lot of good Germans thought long and hard about what was going on in Afghanistan. And we know this from our conversations, and we know it from polling data. And I'll tell you about a couple of the people that I worked with, not their names, and in fact, both of them are probably not even alive anymore. One was a young Afghan who had come to Germany a few years before the Soviet invasion, and he ran a student group. They organized protests. They put out a marvelous color magazine. They call themselves students. They were in their late 20s, early 30s. But they had all come to Afghanistan as students and then been isolated there after the invasion. And they had a good base to work with. First of all, a lot of Afghans who lived in Germany, who'd been there for years. And they have historic ties between Germany, anthropologists, historians, and people and the Afghans are Aryans, which was another factor in their favor. Probably most importantly, there was a solid core of Afghan scholars in Germany. And as my friend explained to me, if you are a product of the German educational system, this commands a lot of respect among the Germans. So we had a base of operations to work with, and as I said, he put out this beautiful magazine with colors that were, I think, of National Geographic quality, which bothered me. You have to be suspicious in this business. So I asked him, where do you get these pictures? How do they get to you? And some of them were, scenery. Some were Soviet tanks that had been blown up. But a lot of them were atrocity pictures. So you saw children without arms, legs, hands, feet, that sort of thing. And so he said, this is the way it works. Our people inside take these pictures. Then they make their way to Kabul. And there we have a friend who's a flight engineer for the national airline, whose name I can't remember, and probably doesn't exist anymore. And once a month, he is assigned to a flight to Prague. He goes to Prague. He then takes a train to Nuremberg. And he brings the canisters out to us, and then they make their way back to us. Another time, he published what was a funeral oration by an Afghan woman. And, I had this great job in my time there. I spent most of my time in Munich, which was wonderful because I was meeting agents in beer halls and fancy restaurants, which were really beer halls with just higher prices. And that was a lot of fun. But working with the Afghans, it would break your heart because you go to meet them, and every second or third session they'd start reeling off all the names of the people they knew who had been killed. So anyway, he published this funeral oration of an Afghan woman. She's burying her son, and it's the third son she's lost in the fighting. And she explains that she has passed her childbearing years and she won't have any more children. And she only has one son left who's 14 years old. And as soon as the funeral's over, he's going to the front to fight the Russians. And so I said to him, promise me that you didn't make this up, because it sounds like almost pure propaganda. And he said, I swear to you, it's not. He said, it is a literal account of what actually happened. And, at this point, I'm thinking, they can't conquer this country unless they kill everybody. There's no way. But get back to the German thing. I sent him, or he took my money and went to Geneva in November of '85, the first Reagan-Gorbachev summit, and they went there to demonstrate, to make their case. And while he was there, he met Petra Kelly. Now, a lot of people probably don't remember who Petra Kelly was. She was a very charismatic, young German-American woman who had spent a lot of time in the United States. She worked for Teddy Kennedy on the Hill. And she was one of the founders of the Green Party. So she heard about my friend and his group, so she came to them and said, I'd like to address your people. And she said, would you interpret for me? And he said, I'd be glad to. And they became friends. And she said, we'll keep in contact. I had hoped at one point I might be able to go talk to her through him. Probably wouldn't get very far. She'd probably slap me in the face and throw me out. But I thought, too many of our assets were on the right side of the spectrum. We needed to go back to the early 50s, where we had alliances with the anti-communist left. And she'd been kicked out of East Germany for her peace activities. Anyway, it didn't happen. I did see her only once, and one day I was coming back to the embassy, and I'm pulling on the big heavy iron gate, and she was on the other side, and she was there with her companion. His name was Gerrit Bastian. He was a general, and about 6-7 months later, he killed her. He shot her and then committed suicide. They lived just up the river near Cologne. But this guy was very clever. He was really a natural for this kind of work. And he decided to put on an exhibit at the Frankfurt Book Fair. And the Frankfurt Book Fair is where people buy and sell manuscripts and promote books. It is supposed to be completely apolitical. And he found a way around this. He rented a booth. He decorated it with atrocity pictures and books on Afghanistan, and put a little barbed wire around it. And he had a TV and a VCR that showed footage from inside the country. And a lot of Germans stopped and saw it and commented that, that we feel for you and so forth and so on, and we wish you well, and we understand what's going on there, and so forth and so on. So I came in one morning, and somebody trashed the exhibit and taken the TV and the VCR. So I had to, send a cable back to headquarters and say, it was rented equipment, so we're going to have to pay for it. But in a way, it's kind of it's a success story. It meant that it ticked off somebody enough to go in there and trash the exhibit, and we just reopened it. We reopened it the next day. I had another contact. Actually, I was thinking about, just before I started talking, I also used to meet a guy in Munich who was an Uzbek, who was a friend of a friend, and he was smuggling Korans into Afghanistan to go back into the Soviet Union. They had a rat line in and back through, and I used to get these boxes at what's the big barracks in Munich, the Kaserne, I can't remember. I think of Kelly. Kelly is in Stuttgart, but it's the other one. McGraw Kaserne. It was an SS place. And these boxes of Korans would come in, and I'd take them to the train station, put them in a locker, and then I'd meet him in a beer hall and give him the key, and he'd go get them. And I guess they got it. He also drank beer, by the way, so I'm not sure he was reading the Quran, but didn't seem to bother him anyway. But the other fellow was a journalist, and his heart really bled for the Afghans. And I sent him many times to Afghanistan. He was very close to Hekmiatar, and he knew him exactly what he was dealing with. He knew all of the commanders, but he was especially close to them. And, he would lecture me about the realities there. How the aid we sent got siphoned off. So he said probably less than 20% of what you send actually makes it across the border to the Mujahideen. He kept saying you need to give them missiles. And I recall this movie, Charlie Wilson's War, with the scene where Tom Hanks goes out and visits the refugee camps, and then he goes to see the chief, the CIA station chief, and tells him, you have to do something about this. You have to give them missiles so they can defend themselves. And the CIA guy says, well, we can't do that. And he says, why? He said, because the Russians will find out. And Hank says, but it's the Cold War. And he said, everybody knows about it. But there, even within the CIA, there was a lot of reluctance to do this because they thought it was risky and upsetting people. How much time do you have left?
Just 1 minute.
All right. I didn't talk at all about Poland. Poland was a fabulous operation. We were able to do all kinds of wonderful things there because right in the middle of the program, the revolution in personal electronics kicked in. I've written an article about this. It's just come out in Poland. It's called Before the Internet, Facebook, and Twitter, How Solidarity Used Western Technology to Defeat Communism. In the early days, we tried to smuggle in books, printing presses. We had to buy a little printing press, take them apart, take them in piece by piece. Then suddenly we're sending in computers, floppy disks, VCRs, Bearcat scanners. It changed everything. Really a radically different situation. So since I'm running out of time, but I have a lot more to say, let me say, compare the two. The Afghan operation cost $2 billion. The Polish operation cost less than 20. Seth will have this number in his book, by the way, Artur. I couldn't say it until today, but it's in his book, so I can use the number. It was always considered classified. Big difference, two different kinds of covert operations. Which one was more important? In my opinion, it was the Polish operation. I wrote a monograph about this, and I made a movie about it. The movie is not the movie's classified. I can tell you that I made it, but I can't. It's not coming to a theater near you anytime soon. But the bottom line is that the Afghan operation was very important. It did major damage to the Soviet Union, but it didn't overthrow the system. It didn't give rise to a popular uprising. And I said the bottom line is in Afghanistan, the Soviets lost a war, but in Poland, they lost an empire. And I think most historians agree that the beginning of the end of communism was the rise of solidarity, the suppression of solidarity, and the revival of solidarity in 1988, 89. Just two quick points about covert action. I haven't developed this theme, but for those of you who are interested in it, one is to succeed, and we failed many, many times in the 40s. To succeed, you must have an indigenous force that you can work with. And Poland and Afghanistan were ready-made for this. We had nations in revolt. Number two, you have to play the long game. You can't start it on Monday and hope that it's finished by the weekend. And unfortunately, that's the way the American bureaucracy runs, because people's careers and their promotions and their perks are tied to results, to quick results. They don't take the long opinion. The Soviets always take the long range view. The second list on the Poland thing was very close to my heart, because the Poles used to say that the Western allies at Yalta sentenced them to a life under communism. And I think what we did for solidarity was, in some small way, it was a down payment on what we owed them for a situation that we probably couldn't have changed. And the last comment is as I think back on the things that I did any of it make any difference? Absolutely not. The way I looked at it, I was a combat soldier in a war that I couldn't win and I couldn't lose, but I showed up, I did my part. And if it's contributed to the larger picture, so be it. But I could live with myself for what we did and how we did it. Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, Austin Long.
Thanks. And so the intro to my comments will actually tie in very nicely with some of Ben's remarks in a way I didn't anticipate. So I'm going to talk a little bit basically about the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. I think basically looking at what the parallels with the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan have been and what the divergences are. And I'm going to really only highlight three because I don't have that much time and I'd rather get into the discussion. So I'll talk a little bit about the decision to intervene and the implications, and this is where I think it ties in very nicely with some of Ben's remarks. I'm going to talk about the course of the war and some parallelism there and things that were ended up being less parallel. And then finally, the end of the war, and particularly withdrawal. So I'll try and do all of that in about 15 minutes. So talking about the Afghan decision, Arturo mentioned it this morning. Ben came back to it this afternoon. The Soviets did not intervene lightly, nor with anything like unanimity in Afghanistan. They were all good Marxists. They had read, what the conditions for the sort of proletarian revolution they believed they were espousing were, and they could all more or less agree that those conditions were nowhere near the case in Afghanistan. Whatever they thought about a peasants' revolution in China, and maybe that was stretching the bounds of Marxist thought, Afghanistan was even further away. Yet they had this thing, the Brezhnev doctrine, right? This idea of limited sovereignty, or more pointedly, once you went commie, you were never going back. And there was a real concern about what the implications of allowing the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan to leave the Soviet orbit would be. David and I were talking briefly. One of the key figures in this was Hafizullah Amin, who was the ruler of Afghanistan most proximately before the Soviet intervention, Columbia University product. And Ben was saying, I'm not really sure why they intervened. I think there are a couple of reasons, and Amin was one of them. He had killed his predecessor, despite Brezhnev more or less point blank telling him not to kill his predecessor. So I think there was a personal level of grievance with the ruler. But at the same time, there was a real concern that the phrase they used was that Amin was going to do a Sadat on us. That Amin, whatever his deep connections to the Central Intelligence Agency and people like Zbigniew Brzezinski was through Colombia, nonetheless, he had decided he was going to switch sides. I don't think the evidence is actually very good that was imminent, but that's what they believed was a possibility. So there was this idea that they were about to leave the orbit, not just into some sort of Yugoslav neutrality, but actually directly into the U.S. sphere. And that would have left their sort of soft underbelly exposed. I think Ben's right to say that the covert action in Afghanistan and Poland are intimately tied together for this reason, is that it was serious threats potentially on their flanks. Central Asia, what are now the independent countries of Central Asia were Soviet republics at the time, and that would have left them vulnerable potentially if the U.S. had an ally in Afghanistan. And then the third thing, and one that's not talked about as much, and I don't think there's quite as much evidence for, but I think it had to sit in the background of the thinking of the Soviets, was the Iranian Revolution. This was a seminal event in that it showed both the United States and the Soviet Union, these sort of two, this is where I wish Professor Westad was here. He has this great sort of line about how these were two empires descended from the Enlightenment, and they had different interpretations of the Enlightenment, but they still sort of shared the same roots. Both were now put on notice with the Iranian Revolution that not only was religion not a spent force, that it actually could destabilize countries that were critical allies. And so with the loss of Iran and the spread of politicized Islam in the vanguard of what they would have normally thought of as revolution, but of course you can't use the term revolution to refer to this anti-progressive movement back to Islam, that clearly had to worry them, because in a sense it was a version of the domino theory, only instead of the spread of communism, it was the spread of political Islam. So from Iran into Afghanistan, from Afghanistan, then does it go into what is now Tajikistan? Does it go into Kyrgyzstan, et cetera? So I think that had to sit in the back of their minds. And there's a little evidence on this from the documents, but I think in part it was because it was so difficult to actually put into writing a lot of these things. Arturo mentioned it, that it was this set of individuals that Ben just mentioned that were in some sense the minority, but a powerful hawkish minority that drove the intervention. But it was still so controversial that they hand wrote the notes that sort of certified the intervention. They didn't even use the word Afghanistan. The title of the memo is concerning the situation in A, and it's handwritten, top secret Politburo record. Even then, right, we're doing everything we can to have the minimal record. It's clear some things could not be said, and I wonder just if political Islam as a force threatening the survival of at least the southern tier of the Soviet Union was one of them. So I think that's the context for intervention. Obviously, we've talked about the U.S. context for intervention was much less well thought through. But I think the similarity the two share is that both sides, once they achieved the sort of initial military success, and the Soviets achieved some quick military success, they replaced Amin, they stabilized at least some of the northern tier of the war. Both sides have quick success and then realize they're in for a very long and painful experience. I think the Soviets realize it a little faster than the United States does, but both, after the decision to intervene, I think end up confronting a much bigger problem than they maybe anticipated. Though both, I think, had some reason to believe they were going to have long-term problems. So I'll shift gears and talk about, for about the next 5 minutes, the course of the war. Here, I think the parallel is much stronger. The Soviets had multiple reasons to intervene, even though they had great trepidation about it. In the United States, it was in response to a direct attack. Course of the war, I think you see lots of evolution in three key areas in how the war was fought by both sides. First is the increasing importance throughout the war for both sides of militia forces. We talked a little bit this morning about the demobilization of militias by the United States. There's a remobilization process through various means. Some of these become transmogrified into forces that the Afghans refer to as campaign forces, funded outside of the military apparatus to conduct operations. In the Soviet case, as Arturo sort of alluded to, the Soviets put a lot of emphasis as the war progresses on recruiting mujahideen, right? Getting people to switch sides in the sort of local deal-making way that Arturo referred to. And I think this was something the United States starts to drive to as well. We have different names for the programs, but in many cases, it's the effort to exploit local grievances that heretofore had led to support for the Mujahideen in the case of the Soviets, or the Taliban in the case of the United States, exploit these grievances in a way to convince people to switch sides. The experience in the 1980s, I think, is instructive in terms of what happened with the Soviets. It proved a very powerful tool for the Soviets. It actually allows, I would argue, it allows them to survive the withdrawal it allows the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan to survive the withdrawal of Soviet forces. So David talked about the Battle of Jalalabad. Some of the most effective forces that the DRA had were not really DRA army units. So this is where General Dostum comes from. He had been basically a thug guarding oil field or gas fields in northern Afghanistan by the time of the Battle of Jalalabad. He officially has an army division, but it's basically his own personal multi-thousand-man, heavily armed militia that's the reliable reserve for the Afghan government. So it's a powerful tool for survival until the money runs out. And this is one of the big concerns I have about the U.S. reliance on these forces is they're quite effective until the money runs out. And what happens with Dostum is very clear. There's a shuffling in 1992, right after the end of the Soviet Union, of commanders in the north. One of them rebels, decides he wants to switch sides and work with the Mujahideen. Dostum quickly follows, and this government that's actually outlived the Soviet Union falls in a matter of months once they start switching sides. My concern is the U.S. has done something quite similar. The Soviets actually did a better job of building the army down there than the United States did, and I think it's principally because their raw material was much more similar to the Afghans than U.S. raw material, right? So the Red Army in the 1980s is still a conscript force. It's built its sort of modus operandi on taking young men more or less off the farm or out of the factory and turning them into halfway decent soldiers, building equipment built for that kind of environment. They have a logistics system that's designed to function in that environment. The United States, when we come in 2001, we've had an all-volunteer force for multiple decades, so it's a very professional force. We've spent the most money of any country ever in terms of building high-tech systems to do things. So we have a system that's set up for highly professionalized, highly technically competent people that we try to impose on some level on the Afghans. So I think the Soviets actually, though they had a variety of problems in building the army, I think they did a much better job, particularly on logistics. That's one of the key weaknesses of the current Afghan security forces. the Army of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan was no great shakes at logistics, but they were at least somewhat better. As David alluded to, they could operate Scud missiles once the Soviets were gone. I think that would be a real challenge for the current Afghan National Security Forces. So I'll conclude talking my last few minutes about how the war ended in comparative perspective. And this is something that was, in a sense, not just an academic product. The last time I worked for the U.S. military in Afghanistan in 2013, this is a lot of what I did, was try to help think through how we were going to withdraw in light of what the Soviet experience was. And so actually there were plenty of commanders that were very interested. One of the depressing things, and I owe this to historian Lester Grau, who's probably the U.S. Army's best historian of the Afghan War. If you take maps from where the Soviets thought they would be once they drew down to very small numbers and laid it over where we were thinking we would be in 2013, there was only one difference, right? There was one place up in Faizabad that they thought they wanted to be that we thought was not as important. But otherwise, they were almost identical. And part of that is just driven by the geography of Afghanistan, but part of it's what happens when you start going to low numbers and trying to get out of places. And the conclusion I drew is that we could expect, what happened to the Soviets and the DRA to happen to us, and that we should prepare for that. I don't know that we did, but I'll run through very quickly some of the lessons I thought were apparent from this. One, prepare to lose provincial capitals. It's just going to happen. You can fight against it pretty hard, but many of these places are quite remote, and you should start bracing. And I'm telling the command this in 2013. Start bracing for remote provincial capitals to be lost. Figure out which ones you think you can afford to lose, and plan accordingly. So for the Soviets, the first provincial capital was in Uruzgan, the first one that they lost, the capital of the city of Tarankat. Raj Manan mentioned this morning, just about 2 weeks ago, there was a major offensive against Tarankat that was barely beat back with heavy Allied air power. Were that air power not in place, I think we would have already lost TK. Probably the same in Kunduz, probably the same in Lashkar Gah. I don't think we've planned for that, honestly. I think the Soviets sort of knew they would be losing some of these places. Host was another one I think they were well aware was just not going to stay supplied and they were going to lose. I don't think the U.S. and its allies have planned for what happens when we start losing actual provincial capitals. How do we prepare the Afghan people, the American people, the international community psychologically for this? I think the other big lesson from the Soviet withdrawal, again, back to logistics, is the demands on the logistics systems of these countries go up as their advisors and their advisors' support goes away, in part because, one of the simple things that, that you can observe about the drawdown from the Soviet period was without Soviet intelligence assets, and that ranges from, the Soviets had their overhead imagery, they had planes, they had all of this. The method of reconnaissance becomes what the military calls reconnaissance by fire. You want to know what's on the other side of the hill, and you can go take a picture of it, that's great. If you can't, fire artillery at it, and then you go look. That was a huge increase with the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan's forces, and I think you've seen the same thing with the current Afghans. So the logistical challenges, which were huge before the United States withdrew, I think are only going to go up. And then the last bit, and then I'll wrap up. Politically, I think there are more similarities than differences in terms of things DePaoli talked about this morning in patrimonial politics, and this gets worse as the withdrawal goes on. So the sort of late ruler of the DRA, Najibullah, starts to shuffle people around in exactly the way that DePaoli talked about, right? That you want to separate people from their base, you want to reward people, things like that. The problem is, as long as you have the lubricant of external support to sort of lubricate that shift, you can sort of buy people off, make sure they stay paid off, and keep them sweet in a sense. Where that starts to unwind is, again, what causes the Dostum effect is he starts to shift people that he thinks are closer to him into places he thinks are critically important. So the sort of first hole in the dike that leads to the very rapid unraveling, he moves a Pashtun to replace a Tajik at a place called Harriman in the north. This is right across the bridge, the friendship bridge from what's now Uzbekistan. So it's a critical node for any last trickles of supplies that come in. The Tajik knows this, that's about to be replaced, and he just refuses to stand down, and he won't let the guy take over. This confrontation ends when he defects, takes all of his forces with him to fight on the side of Ahmad Shah Massoud, and that's what starts triggering a cascade of defections that takes Dostum out. So my worry is I think you see the same patterns across time and space, but it's only the external actors. I mean, we've talked a lot today about external actors generating warlords, influencing politics. I think it's only when the external actors are sort of there to moderate and lubricate this shifting that it works. And so my worry is, as U.S. and international interest wanes in Afghanistan, that ability to manage these shifts is going to go away, and you may potentially see something that looks like the unraveling of the DRA. And so on that happy note, I'll conclude.
Okay, very interesting set of comments. Thank you. So we are now going to open up the conversation to the audience. Do we have a microphone?
Hands all over the country.
Okay, great. Questions for our panel?
Have it first. I've been a hog.
So is Jem, so it's fine.
Yeah, right, yeah. I'm looking at a Times story in October of this year that talks about Afghan forces, their numbers dwindling sharply, face a resurgent Taliban. And in this, it talks about the kind of casualties occurring in the units, and it sort of implies that there's an attrition underway that is like slowly going downhill. And I was wondering what the panel thought about that. And secondly, the question of these battles that you talk about, Jalalabad, how do you assess how al-Qaeda evolves after that? Because we know when we intervened in 2003, when I looked at, I remember, order of battles that were put forth at the time, there's this Arab al-Qaeda, I guess, small division-sized force, if you will, that's there. What are they like? And is there sort of in jihadist looking at how they fight in battle, is there a learning curve going on here that they have perhaps transnationally sending lessons back and forth?
Well, just on the evolution of Al-Qaeda, my impression is that, and here I sort of agree with an author named Faisal Devji, who's written a book called Landscape of Jihad, in which he says that he compares Al-Qaeda to a multinational corporation, a franchisee or a franchisor with franchisees, and that his point is that after 9/11, Al-Qaeda itself as a central organization becomes more or less irrelevant. That it did its damage and it spread there was a series of effects that had no connection to causes, and those effects were kind of random and that were and distributed, and people were no longer looking to Al-Qaeda for leadership or for even inspiration, and I think that that's right. And one aspect of it, I think, is also how Al-Qaeda communicated through videos and through audio tapes through Al Jazeera, and how the Islamic State, as it evolved, used social media in a much more effective way, and also a more decentralized way. So my own impression is that really whether or not Hamid is right that the Battle of Jalalabad is more important than 9/11. Ultimately, I think is arguable, but that it is the case that after 9/11, Al-Qaeda ceases to be really a kind of critical actor.
So on the sort of current security environment, look, I think there are a couple of things that are driving that attrition. One is just there's more combat, right? One of the big things that's happened as U.S. forces have gone down is the ability of the Taliban to actually mass the kind of things that Mujahideen did not do very well at Jalalabad. They subsequently learned. It's been very difficult for the Taliban to do that as long as there were significant U.S. combat forces, because that's what we pray for, right? We pray that we can get in a straight-up gunfight between, a U.S. battalion and a couple of Taliban battalions. That would be awesome. I'm sure Colin, every day he was in ISAF, was praying for that to happen. It wouldn't, because they're not stupid. But what's changed is now even the air power that we bring to bear, in the way that David was talking about, the Soviets ran into real limitations late. We're running into that now because we just don't have that much stuff there. I mean, we talk about 10,000 troops. I mean, that's a fairly limited contingent of air. And if you're talking about multiple large-scale Taliban operations in the north in Kunduz, in Tarankat in the south, and then just over from Tarankat and Helmand, there's only so much to go around. So I think that part of it is just a lot harder fighting. I think part of it is the continued problems of politicization and corruption that are the corollary to the stuff DePauli was talking about, right? That, if you get promoted because of your ethnic identity or your political affiliation, leadership is going to suffer. And that's been a huge problem for the Afghan security forces all along. It was not that this wasn't a problem with the DRA either, right? I mean, we haven't talked a lot about it, but the PDPA was split between a sort of faction that was mostly lower-class Pashtuns and then a faction that was more Tajik. And so, there were attempted coups. So, I mean, they had to do a lot of coup-proofing as well. So it's not that it wasn't a problem for the DRA. I think it's just been more of a problem for the current force. And the last bit is what I talked about logistics. Right? We spent a lot of effort trying to get the ability to pay people regularly, keep them supplied, and as far as I can tell, we might as well have just burned a big pile of money, right? I don't think people are getting paid. I don't think people are getting fuel. I don't think people are getting ammunition, outside of a few very key places. So the fact that you have very significant attrition and desertion rates should be surprising to basically no one. Colin, did you want to?
Yeah, one subtlety on the use of air power right now. I mean, there's a great piece in the Washington Post recently talking about the use of drone air power in the South out of what used to be Camp Bastion. And what the discussion highlights is when you no longer have U.S. troops on the ground with eyes on a target, the person who's in control of the aircraft and the weapon is worried legitimately that they will drop on the wrong target. A civilian target, a target that is not a designated enemy, et cetera, et cetera. And so even though you have, in theory, varying amounts of U.S. air power that could be involved here, once you lose eyes on the ground, a whole other set of incentives lead you not to drop weapons because you're worried you're going to blow up civilians, blow up the wrong people, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a kind of a circuit breaker in the U.S. air power system once you no longer have eyes on the ground. And I will point out this is exactly what we were worried about in 2011 when we started thinking about who should be the last people to leave Afghanistan from the American military point of view. And my argument was tactical air control parties. And that was not the answer that we ended up doing for a lot of different reasons. But anyway, that's another piece that's preventing U.S. air power, which would seem to be such a big tool from 2001 onwards from being a really difference maker.
Well, I found it interesting in this article stressing that the police casualty rate is 2 to 4 times more than average recruitment. A deficit you're translating to a reduction of 10,000 officers a year, which means that the targets that aren't necessarily that effective are being targeted by the Taliban because they're easy to meet.
Well, and they're also the folks you run into the most, right? I mean,
on that point of the police casualties, I mean, it's always that way in Afghanistan because the police are actually doing a military function, just because of the nature of the place, and they have never received the support that they should have, given the function they're performing. And now that resources are less, on the question of your comment, that's absolutely correct, but I think it's an even deeper problem because the whole Rand actually, I don't know if it's published or not yet. What can I say? Okay, let me say it this way. We put a lot of stock in. Well, we have U.S. We're reducing no boots on the ground. And of course, everybody here knows what the SF guys say to that. No boots on the ground. We'll just wear sandals. Anyway, but everybody's neurotic about boots on the ground. Even both of our presidential candidates, see, that's one thing they agree on. I don't know if people have noticed that, but both of them don't want boots on the ground. So this has become a shibboleth. But there's a deeper issue. Okay, so we're saying, well, we're still going to have an influence. We're not walking away because we have advisors. Okay, but here's the issue with advisors. For these advisors to perform the function that they should perform, they have to have two things. One, authority, and secondly, resources. Now, if you don't have the authority to call in airstrikes and the authority to do other things besides airstrikes, and you have to go up your chain of command, and for you to do anything is you do not have agility, you're not time sensitive, because that is the way the advisors are working right now. They've got all these levels that they have to go through, which means that if you're an Afghan commander fighting a battle, these guys are going to help you very much. Okay, that's one. Two, resources. Now, we've seen in the news that, yes, we're doing airstrikes in Afghanistan, but we have greatly reduced the capacity because the way the U.S. military works, you got a huge logistic tail, you got a huge personnel tail. For every plane that flies an airstrike, you've got like 50 people, doing maintenance, doing all kinds of things. I mean, just the way we operate. We have a huge logistical tail. And if you reduce that logistical tail, because your strategy, your foreign policy is to reduce the numbers of people on the ground, well, then you're going to reduce what they can do. And I think this is to the question of the casualty figures, I think this is very demoralizing to the Afghan troops because they can remember when they could just call in airstrikes and get all kinds of support. And there's one more piece to this that I've heard a lot about is medevacs. The U.S. military, I actually think in the history of warfare, we have perfected the medevac to a degree nobody else in the human race has ever done in human history. Okay, we can put people on an operating table in 15 minutes and do brain surgery. All right, and that's why we have so many wounded veterans, back here with all kinds of, very, debilitating conditions, because they don't die, because we save them. Now, we were also helping the Afghans that way when we were there. Now, because we have reduced, it's our policy to reduce, to withdraw, you don't have that medevac capability. And not only are we not medevacing Afghan soldiers, we used to medevac civilians during the heyday of our, and I've heard some harrowing stories because the civilians were used to this. So they would bring desperately ill people, desperately wounded people to the American bases or where the Americans used to be. Now it's the Afghans. So then the Afghans would urgently ask the American advisor, look, we got this desperately ill person here on the runway. They're literally sitting on the runway. And the American says, I can't do anything. So they die on the runway. What does that do for everybody's morale? So that's one issue of our withdrawal.
Sir, do you have a question for the panel?
Yes.
I was going to say, there needs to be a question mark somewhere in there.
Yeah, no, those are comments. I can comment. I have now a different function because I'm sitting up here, so I can comment, right? I was commenting on these questions. Yes, this comes under the rubric of commenting on a question. Now, a question. But again, I don't want to hog everything. Does somebody else have another question? This is going to be long. Yes. Yeah,
Okay,
we can come back to you.
I'm not going away. It's not even 3 o'clock.
Plenty of time.
You're ahead of schedule, aren't you?
Plenty of time.
Yeah, all right.
When the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001, why did they target the state and the Taliban when they knew that the Afghanistan government and the Taliban were not terrorists. I think Professor Long and Arturo sort of, answered this question already, but I wish you could just clarify a little bit more, because the United States had the technology then to do just surgical attacks on the Taliban, and I just wonder why they didn't do that, since that was supposed to be the purpose. Al-Qaeda. I'm sorry. Thank you.
So I'll let others comment, including Arturo, since he has insight on this, but we gave the Taliban an opportunity, right? From our perspective, we had the head of the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence fly on a U.S. CIA aircraft to Kabul to say, look, the Americans don't even want everybody from Al-Qaeda. They want these, I forget, 17, I think, bin Laden, Zawahiri, 15 others, roughly 7. Maybe I'm off a little bit, but not even 100, like couple dozen, less than a couple dozen. And the Taliban said, nah, I don't know. Can we not give them to the Americans? Can we give them to a third party? And so he goes back and reports this to the Americans. We're like, nah, we pretty much want these people. And so there's a back and forth, basically from a couple of days after September 11th till October 7th of 2001, when we basically say, you've had your chance, you won't hand these guys over. That means, you have to put yourself back in the mindset of the time. You're not with us, you're against us. We gave you your chance to give these guys up and show that you're not terrorists, and you didn't. It may not be right. I agree 100% with Arturo that even if you thought that was the right thing to do at the time, once you defeated them, you should have let them come in from the cold. But from our perspective, we did give them an opportunity to separate themselves out, and they didn't. Did you want to?
I would agree with that. And they actually hemmed and hawed, and Foreign Minister Mutawakil actually gave a counteroffer, which he described afterwards, to me in detail. He says, we offered to have a trial in Kabul, and is under Sharia law, of bin Laden. We'll put him on trial. And what you have to do is bring the evidence. And if we find him guilty, we'll execute him. And the thing is, the Taliban was actually very split. And I would argue that most Taliban actually didn't like bin Laden and didn't like the Arabs and didn't like the Wahhabis. They never have, not even during the first jihad against the Soviets. There was all kinds of tension there between the Wahhabi Arabs and the Afghan Mujahideen. That's a whole other issue. So there was a big split. They weren't unanimous. See, the Taliban have never been unanimous. They're different factions and different personalities, different regions, different tribes. They're very heterogeneous in that respect. And they offered to give the Islamic trial for bin Laden, and of course we laughed that off. And then the third country that you're talking about, that was another counteroffer. I mean, there was a process of negotiating here, and then we got fed up with it and say, okay, your description is pretty accurate. But just for the point of analysis, it's interesting to see what counteroffers they made. The other counteroffer was, yeah, okay, we're going to send them to a third country, but it has to be a Muslim country. But then you had to find a Muslim country that would take these people. Now, meanwhile, there's something else going on, illustrating, again, that people just don't focus on. It's really tragic that we were so angry, we were so pissed off, and we were so hell-bent on doing what we want to do. But here's something else we should have paid attention to, and we didn't. And it was reported in the U.S. press. A meeting, what do they call it, when all the mullahs get together? Oh, come on. It's not a jura, an ulema of 1,000 Taliban mullahs and Malawis, especially Malawis, who count more, they're more educated. They gathered in Kabul, 1,000 Taliban mullahs and Malawis, petitioning Mullah Muhammad Omar and the Taliban government to send bin Laden out of Afghanistan, because they were afraid that if they didn't do that, the U.S. was going to invade. because they knew what he had done. And actually, most Afghans didn't agree with it. You know, I talked to a Taliban commander who was actually in the fields putting down rebellions against the Taliban. And this guy was a classic went to the madrasa, then went to the Islamic University in Pakistan, graduated from the Islamic University of Pakistan, got military training, became a Taliban commander. This is as hardcore as you can get. And he told me, and I believe him. Maybe he was pulling my leg, maybe it's a wily Pashtun telling me a story. I frankly believe him, given the rest of what I know about him. But he said, I was campaigning, putting down rebellions. This guy's not liberal, he's very conservative, very Taliban. And I heard the news about the plane that was flown into a building. And my initial reaction was, what madman did this? Who flies a plane into a building full of people? This is insane, my goodness. And he said, I felt sorry for all the people in the building. And he told me, in the same conversation, I never imagined that this act of terrorism would be used as an excuse to attack my country. Because I have never talked to a Taliban, and I've talked to a good number of them, who identify with Al-Qaeda or bin Laden or think they had anything to do with him. All right? Now, they did because he was there, They let their country be used as a sanctuary. But they didn't know what he was up to. And all the evidence indicates that bin Laden did not confide in Mullah Omar and tell him what he was doing. I actually think Mullah Muhammad Omar was as surprised as anybody else by 9/11. I got other comments, but I don't want to hog.
I would just add one other thing, too, that it came out this morning about how a decisive mistake was labeling the Taliban as a terrorist organization. That became, in one sense, the kind of the edge of the spear. But the other part of it that we sometimes forget about is the role of women's rights in that first discourse around intervention in Afghanistan. And I think in some ways women's rights was the backward-facing barb. If counterterrorism was what provoked the intervention, what kept us there was in one sense the whole discourse on women's liberation. And so, as it was mentioned this morning, the Bush administration campaigned in the 2000 election against nation building. It was strongly against it, but they, in some sense, got trapped by the use of the rhetoric of women's liberation as they campaigned in that period right after 9/11 for intervention. And I think we forget how strong that was. I remember a documentary that appeared again and again on CNN called Behind the Veil that talked about how the situation with women in Afghanistan was so unhealthy and so tyrannical. There was never any kind of understanding of the role of the burqa, the role of the place of women in Afghan society became a very black and white issue. And I think that we got trapped in part by our own, the rhetoric that we had first espoused in getting in there, it prevented us from getting out.
I agree with that. I think it's an excellent point.
Sorry, we've got more. There's somebody right.
Hi, thanks. I had just a quick question about the state of Afghan studies as the U.S. sort of draws down its participation in Afghanistan. So, on the one hand, clearly U.S. involvement in the country has resulted in a great deal of academic, anthropological attention on various issues in Afghanistan. But at the same time, that interest has been accused of being sort of instrumentalized by the military campaign of the United States. So I just wonder, perhaps this is for Professor Edwards and for academics and historians as well, but where do you see the field sort of going as the operations wind down?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not quite sure. In the 1960s and 70s, there was this huge proliferation of anthropological studies by Americans and Brits and Germans, a variety of people who had the opportunity to work in Afghanistan. And I won't speak about political science because I know less about that literature. And I was at the tail end of that generation, and I first decided to become an anthropologist in large part from reading the works of those people. And by the time I got to graduate school, the first year of graduate school was when the Sour Revolution happened. So I had to suddenly go from being an anthropologist of tribal society to be an anthropologist of refugees and of political Islam. There really wasn't a lot that went on among anthropologists all through the war. There was a very brief window, people like Noah Coburn, who wrote a really excellent book recently called Losing in Afghanistan, an obituary for an intervention. There were a few people who managed to get into Afghanistan, but by and large, there were very few of them. So where Afghanistan studies, there's an active Afghanistan Studies Association out of Boston University that Tom Barfield is president of. But the fad of Afghanistan, the money that's available for scholarship, for fellowships, the security situation all mitigate against the field expanding right now. Sadly, because I think when I first arrived in Peshawar in 1982 and set up shop with a Fulbright fellowship, there was nobody there. Nobody had. There were obviously a lot of CIA people and other people, but in terms of independent scholars, there were virtually none. So it was a fascinating time, and I think right now is also a fascinating time with tremendous implications. But I'm not sure that people are actually are going over there. But I'm at an undergraduate college, so I'm less informed about what is happening with graduate programs.
For a sec. Just because I'm Tom's vice president for that institute, so I can say, we are actually supporting quite a bit of research that's still going on by graduate students, postdocs, junior faculty, both inside Afghanistan, which is trickier to do these days, but also about Afghanistan, which includes research on refugees, on more historical work, regional work, etc. But just to speak about political science, I think there was a generation of scholars like Austin and myself that began to be able to do field work after 2001, and actually it was very much possible to do that. My last field trip was in 2014, which was a very difficult trip for me. I would say after 2012, getting out of Kabul became difficult, and I think it's going to be an incredibly challenging time for the study of the country. My one hope and excitement is there are actually a really remarkable set of Afghan scholars who have gotten doctorates at universities and written master's theses, and a number of us are strongly encouraging them to publish their work, and it's really good scholarship. So that's something to look out for too.
And Ben might comment on this too, but the other thing that I think is very useful is what Arturo and I both alluded to, Ben as well, in terms of documents. So, contemporary study of Afghanistan, I agree with Polly, is going to be very challenging. I haven't been outside of Kabul since 2012, except with the U.S. military, and just because I don't think it's advisable, and certainly not into the south or parts of the east. But there's a ton of new documents that are available in many different languages. So there's a lot more that's available in Russian. Even there've been the documents started coming out in the 90s. There's more and more that's available even just in the past few years in terms of decision making, things like that. So I think that's underexploited in Russian. Ben, you might comment. I don't know if you know what's available in some of the other former Warsaw Pact archives. I wonder if there's anything in there.
I don't think there is. I don't know. I stand by my initial statement that I know nothing about Afghanistan.
But you know archives real well.
But I know archives, yeah. No, I don't know, because I've never looked at what's available from this perspective. We have a lot in the military sphere, and we have a lot in the political sphere, especially from East Germany. We have, because the country collapsed, so we were able to take over the archives. The stuff coming out of Russia, there was a very small window in the early 90s when it was fairly open and accessible, but that closed pretty quickly. So they pretty much have to live with what.
Well, there's more coming out now. We should share, but like I don't know about Afghanistan specifically, but Argani and Garf and some of the state archives, presidential archives, they're letting stuff out.
Okay.
But it's older, right?
Yeah.
But it might include stuff on
Could be.
Afghanistan.
Yeah, and this is not Goodwill, but they're selling this stuff, or in the old days they would sell things off.
This is at least notionally Goodwill.
Okay.
Now, is it going to be selective release?
Probably.
Almost surely.
Yeah.
But
You don't know until you see it. Yeah.
Jack?
I wanted to ask about the comparative advantages of different kinds of great powers in projecting power into places like Afghanistan. Partly this question was sparked by, Austin, what you said about the Soviet Army being better at military institutional building compared to the U.S., a kind of comparative advantage of appropriate organizational technologies. And in part it's sparked by something that Kim said this morning about what do you need to be effective in an Afghan-type environment, and it's intelligence. You need to know who cares about what in each and every local nook and cranny, which made me think about the book by Paul MacDonald called Networks of Domination, where he asks the question of how did the British dominate India with a handful of soldiers and a handful of administrators, and his answer is because of their experience trading with the commercial folks and the moguls and so forth of India. They knew exactly what they wanted, how to entice them, how to divide and rule them. So the question is, okay, you have these different great powers surrounding Afghanistan that have different things they're good at. Some of them are patronage states that know how to be corrupt and plug into patronage networks. But they do it in different styles. There's a Chinese way, there's a Russian way. Some of them are good at creating infrastructure. Some of them have different trading opportunities that they offer, but with different rules of the game. So is there kind of a rule of thumb about what kind of great power is going to be effective using what tools in an Afghan-type environment? What are the implications of that for who should actually be doing the job of stabilizing the Afghanistans of the world, and what tools and strategies should they be adopting?
Maybe should we collect a few since
Sure.
we're wrapping up?
You're the moderator. You decide.
Yeah, so let's just collect a few. I think there's one.
No, it was partly answered. I was just wondering to what extent you spoke a bit about the role of American specialists in helping define pinpoint our policy. I have studied Soviet experts in the Third World, and from my experience, I know that both privately and in their published articles or books, they began to question the wisdom of Soviet expansion into the Third World, that it was not an automatic alliance. And they never thought they had any influence in in the government or with the military. But to me, reading this academic press, sort of revealed the other side of the issue, and that the war certainly was not leading toward a victory and was too complicated to deal with and dangerous, costly, and so on. In other words, non-productive. But do you, having ties to Washington or people in the policies, do you think that our specialized academic community has much to say or much to help with? Thank you.
Any other questions? Kim?
I have a very basic question that I'm surprised didn't come up in any of the discussion today, which is in the past there was a real pitched debate about how important Stinger missiles were in the defeat of the Soviets, and nobody talked about that today. So I'd just like to know where that debate ended up. Way back when, it was an academic debate between Sarah Mendelson and Rick Harriman, and if we know the answer to that, I'd be interested in hearing what it is.
Colin looks like he has.
I just want to broaden the question, which is we didn't talk a lot about the significance, we didn't talk a lot about the relative significance of Pakistan as a deciding element as opposed to a supporting element in the 1980s episode or our own. I'm fascinated by it. If we had had a bunch of U.S. military officers in here, the conversation would immediately have gone to Pak sanctuary as they talk about it. You know, if only we could get at Pakistan, then the whole thing, or their sponsorship of the Taliban, the whole thing would fall apart. To me, it's an interesting analytical question. How important is this sanctuary relative to other things that are driving rebellion? So beyond Stinger missiles to this bigger broker issue.
Jim, last question.
Well, I'd be curious to hear what new insights people have on the debates that happened in 2003. That is the shifting of resources from Afghanistan to Iraq. And then secondly, in secondary sources, it's alleged that Cofer Black, several weeks into the 9/11 aftermath, comes in with a plan to have all these covert operations all over the world. Is that accurate or not? And finally, what's your assessment of the tactics we adopted? Because when I would talk to Bing West when he would come back from Afghanistan, I remember saying, my God, look at this, platoons spread over areas of operation that, in Vietnam, you would have had, it was mind-boggling. So I'm wondering what, your assessment is of those kind of tactics, that we adopted simply because we didn't have the manpower to implement something more intense.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes, I think, till our session is supposed to close. So we maybe go a couple. Okay, we can run a little late. But David, why don't you start and pick up whatever you wish to.
Or anything you thought
Or
of.
whatever else.
Okay. Just on I don't know the literature on Stinger missiles. What I know is my conversations with Afghan mujahideen who give great credit to the Stinger for immobilizing or forcing helicopters to go out of the role that they played in, say, 1984, up until when they first arrived, when helicopters were doing tremendous damage. But more generally, I think there's a really interesting history to be written about the evolution of weaponry in Afghanistan from Lee Enfield rifles that were the dominant weapon when I first arrived in 1982, and how AK-47s and RPGs changed the dynamics of warfare in really profound ways. And then, going forward, the role of Datsun and Toyota pickup trucks, and how they allowed Afghan mujahideen, for small units of five or six people with AK-47s and RPGs, to dominate whole areas. And they became particularly important during the Civil War period. One of the aspects of that period when there was this anarchy and local mujahideen commanders became warlords or have their fiefdoms was really the mobility that four-wheel drive pickup trucks provided them. And then, of course, later on, and Colin this morning talked about that, I think it was Act 3, was it, that where in 2006, 2007, when the suicide bombing suddenly became, IEDs and suicide bombing became one of the dominant ways in which the Taliban adapted to the new security environment that the Americans were implementing. And then, of course, drones later on. Each of these is a stage that really completely dominated and changed the nature of warfare. And I think you also need to, and something I argue in the book that's coming out shortly, you have to look at drones and suicide bombings actually in parallel with each other. There's a kind of dialogue that goes on between drone attacks and suicide bombings.
I'm going to wait till she's writing this down.
Oh, okay.
No, I think the Stingers made all the difference. You can read accounts of this in Milt Bearden's book. And the reason is because of the Soviet helicopters, the Mi-24. The Soviets in Afghanistan basically couldn't go out of their barracks that they built in the urban areas any other way. They didn't have mobility, and the helicopters are what gave them mobility, and the Stingers is what gave the Mujahideen the ability to shoot down the helicopters. There's a very graphic description of this in Bearden's book, the very first one or two helicopters that they shot down. But like everything else, it was a good idea that went bad because they didn't keep control. I had to review a memoir of the CIA officer who claims that he was in charge of the Stinger program. He even claims he was the one that made the decision. He wasn't. It was a committee decision. And he said, but there was no security problem. He said, we sent people up and down in the tribal areas and looked in the arms markets and so forth, and we never found any. It was an absolute bald-faced lie. They were all over the place. And we mentioned Hekmatyar a couple of times. He was known to have taken the Stingers and sold them to the Iranians. They became a way to make money. And so then the CIA, after the Soviet withdrawal, had to spend billions of dollars to try to buy these missiles back. And I wrote something once where I referred to this to refute the memoir, and I was told I couldn't talk about it, but I found a way around it. But they were paying what, 3, 4, 5 times per missile what it cost to build them in the first place. You mentioned something very interesting about, there's this debate about how early did the CIA start helping the Mujahideen. Brzezinski has made some claims about this, about providing aid long before the Soviet, not long before, months before, to sort of lure the Russians in and then give them their Vietnam. But you're right, the first things that we sent in were 303 old British infield rifles. Have been around since what? At least the turn of the century? Yeah. Right around the turn of the century. But the other things that you mentioned were critically important. The AK-47, as I said, that was before the missile, before we were still maintaining the illusion that we were not involved there. And that's why the Stinger missile decision was so difficult to make, and why it was so controversial. And then, of course, after the fact, there's a lot of people who claim credit for it. Before the fact, there were a lot of people who were against it. That's why I mentioned the scenario in the movie where the CIA station chief says we can't give them missiles because the Russians will find out. But there were people very high up in the CIA who opposed this decision. In Poland, we provide people with books and periodicals. They didn't like that either. They thought that was provocative. So it's a long ways from selling books into Poland to sending Stinger missiles to Afghanistan. It was the right decision, but it was done in the wrong way because we lost control of them.
If I can just follow up, the argument is not whether the Stinger missiles initially had a very strong effect. The argument is whether the Soviets were able to sufficiently adapt their tactics to the fact of the Stinger missiles, and whether the Stinger missiles were actually the decisive weapon in terms of creating the Soviet withdrawal.
What do you think?
So I don't think they were decisive at all. I do think, yeah. I think Ben and David are absolutely right. They were important, particularly very early, because the Soviets went from more or less impunity. I mean, the Muj would occasionally have Dishkas that they could shoot them down with, but it was a huge leap forward. But to your point, there was adaptation. It reduced their efficacy throughout, right? Because it did. It forced you to fly higher, stand off more. So their big tactics late in the war revolved around Spetsnaz being inserted with helicopters, then supported by gunships. If you have to stand off more, where you drop them off and you can't support them as well. So anyway, it certainly had an effect, but not nearly as decisive as some of its proponents would argue, particularly when you look at the historiography that we now know about decision making that we've kind of alluded to.
Yeah.
The decision to get out precedes the introduction of stingers, right? Not by a ton, but it is, so they were already on the way out. I mean, this may have been, an extra push out the door, but
I think that's what Alan Cooperman argues,
yeah,
right?
Cooperman has argued that a bit later, but I think he was making that argument before all of the documents were even available. So a couple other things. I mean, Colin, your point about Pakistan not just as, lily pad, but as place where things are decided, I think you're right. We haven't talked about nearly enough, because their decision about where to funnel aid, I mean, you talk about covert action. I think one of the differences, at least you may correct me, Ben, with Poland and Afghanistan, is we had a lot more agency in determining how the aid went into Poland, whereas in Afghanistan, we more or less relied very heavily on ISI to decide who it went to. So it went to Hekmatyar was a big recipient, and you mentioned Hik as well. So, I mean, it was really these Pashtuns who are often towards the more radical end of the Islamic spectrum. They had no interest in arming Tajiks, so I think that was important then. It's important now. I do disagree with your military students, though, that if only we could get after the sanctuary, things would be better. I think we would just have a larger problem, right? I mean, we're going to suddenly go from trying to pacify sort of the old Afghanistan centers. Now we're going to add Peshawar and Fatah. Where does it end?
No, I tend to agree with you, but what's interesting is it's a line of argument
Yeah.
very similar to the sort of Korean War argument.
Oh, yeah.
Let me bomb Manchuria and things going to be better.
If only we could invade Cambodia, Colin, things would be fine.
Same structural argument. But I'll tell you that the military sees it as a contract broken. The military sees it as a contract broken between the administration and the military on Afghan strategy. So the way that they look at it is the Riedel report that comes out in early 2009 says we're going to have comprehensive counterinsurgency, it's going to be fully resourced, and we're going to get PAC cooperation, active cooperation in eliminating the sanctuaries. And the sense from the military side has always been, and I think this is a little fanciful, but that because somehow the administration didn't compel Pakistan to shut down its cooperation or its sanctuary, the military can't defeat the opponent inside the borders of Afghanistan. And there is both a little to that and a little that's overdrawn, in my opinion, but it's an interesting issue.
It's also worth mentioning that that we have, if not gone after sanctuaries, we've gone after individual Taliban leaders, and with very limited. I mean, we've eliminated some of those leaders, but we've also created a whole lot of new opponents. And one of the Baitul Masood, who was himself later killed in a drone strike, said not too long before he himself was killed that when I tried to recruit suicide bombers before the drones came, I was getting nowhere. As soon as the drone strikes began, I had people beating down my door to become suicide bombers.
Jack, in answer to your question about comparative great power advantage, I think I can't say what the right answer is, like who would be the right intervener. I can tell you almost categorically the United States is the wrong intervener. If there's an organization, here I'm going to sound a little partisan, but if there's an organization that actually can do this kind of thing relatively well in terms of agility, intelligence, things like that, it's the Central Intelligence Agency. The thing, though, about CIA that makes it agile and flexible and all that is the fact that while its manpower is classified, it is probably of the same order of magnitude as the entire Foreign Service, which is like 13,000 people. Right, so when there's a commitment at the unclassified level of 1,000 people to the station in Kabul, 1,000 people, that's like a non-trivial chunk of the workforce in one country, and yet the agency has global responsibilities, et cetera. I think the rest of the U.S. government is uniquely poorly suited for this, right? State Department is great, but they're diplomats. We've asked them in places like Afghanistan to become ersatz colonial administrators, and with a few sort of random exceptions, Carter Malkasian that Colin mentioned this morning, who's not a Foreign Service officer, he took a Foreign Service limited posting to go become the the administrator of Garmsir, but he's an outlier, right? The rest of the State Department, and look, it's what they do. They're diplomats. They're not colonial administrators. USAID sort of used to kind of halfway be that thing. We completely transformed the organization after the Cold War into basically a project management organization, right, that contracts out to Chemonics and every other frickin' contractor you can think of. So they're not well suited for it. The U.S. military, particularly the U.S. Army, post-Vietnam, rebuilt itself as a thing that beats other armies. It doesn't occupy territory. It had one mission that it decided was of paramount importance, which was to defend Western Europe. And it rebuilt itself along lines that the Israelis seemed to show in 1973, which is we're going to have a high-tech, very well trained force that will be a counterpuncher. Armies will come across the line and we'll knock them out. But it is not set up to build other people's armies up, right? Because all of its allies in NATO were at least, halfway competent. So it's not set up to build armies in these places. It's not set up really to provide security in these places, right? So it's really good at being the hammer that knocks down the door. I mean, in 2003, I think you saw that very well in Iraq. It's not the organization to put it together. So what I'm saying is I don't know what the right answer for comparative advantage for great power intervention is. I just know that the United States in the 21st century is almost uniquely incapable of it. On the specialists, unfortunately, I think you're right. I think even specialists that have access to the government, I don't think we end up doing the right thing. Arturo talked this morning a lot about his view of how to shape local defense forces, and people in the government even started to buy into the idea, and then I think more or less botched the implementation because we're just not really set up to do it. I don't know if you want to have a word on that, Arturo.
No, I would agree. We did it. It first started out as local defense initiative.
Yeah.
And Ambassador Eikenberry hated it. And certain elements of the Afghan government didn't like it, and that's why they created, the Afghan government, ALP, which ALP is a negation of the whole idea, because it's top down, and it puts the authority in the hands of the police chief. The way the local defense forces were originally conceived is the Jirga was going to handle it. We're trying to imitate the Arbakai. What we're trying to do is a new, sophisticated counterinsurgency in tune with the local culture and the local structure, integrating ourselves into the local structure. And no, the U.S. military, one of the recommendations we made is do not put them in uniform. This is what Arbakai commanders recommended to us. Don't put them in uniform and don't pay them a salary. So what do? As soon as we institute the program, put them in uniforms and pay them a salary. Because that's what we do. And that's what the Afghans wanted too, because they couldn't stand the idea of tribal guys with guns answering first to their tribal elders. They couldn't stand it. All right, they wanted the central government. So there we go again. We're trying to create something artificial for the first time, because that's what we're comfortable with. And I would agree with you. Are we capable of doing this? I would say no.
So I think we have expertise. I think the government even accesses some of it. I just don't think it actually translates itself any more than I think you're right that it did with the Soviets into really functional policy. I wish I could be less of a bummer.
So, you mind if I log in and answer maybe
Sure, then we'll wrap up.
Story just to stir the pot? I can only think of two states that are good at sort of building proxies as a main line of business in their security complex, and that's Pakistan and Iran. And they've had difficulty controlling groups that they build, but boy, they've done a good job of standing up a state within a state in Hezbollah, ties with Hamas, stuff in Yemen, popular mobilization forces in Iraq, special groups in Iraq, the entire Syrian civil war, as far as I can tell. So there are people who are good at building proxies, but what I find fascinating is almost no one appears to be great at controlling them once they construct them.
Okay, well, on that uplifting note, I think we are going to wrap up this session with many thanks to our panelists and turn it back over to our organizers.
Do you want to give the final blessing? No, you should. Okay. Well, so thank you very much for your attention. I think we've had two very productive sessions, sort of exploring the current and the historical context for the U.S. and Russia in the Afghanistan context. It's been a great pleasure to put this on and get to bring down or bring up, depending on which direction they're coming from, a lot of great speakers. So I just want to give thanks again to all of the folks that spoke, and thank the audience for being very attentive, hanging out with us on a Friday where maybe it's going to be the last sunny day we get for a while. What's that? Oh, right. And so the reward is we now have refreshments, and you can continue the conversation with the speakers if they're willing to hang around. So thanks very much again. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you.